4 seconds. That was all the room gave her to be right. The dog's teeth were bared, its handler was down on the tile with blood pooling under his elbow, and every phone in the corridor was already recording the moment a 200-pound patrol dog named Bishop decided who lived and who didn't. "Nobody move," she said, and her voice did not shake, though the automatic doors behind her kept trying to close on the sound of the alarm. "He won't hurt me." Somewhere behind the nurse's station, a woman was screaming for security, and Chief Marcus Vance, the man who 12 hours earlier had told her she was nothing more than a mop and a name badge, stood frozen with his hand on a holster. Bishop's growl dropped an octave. His ears, which had been flat against his skull, began almost imperceptibly to rise. She took one step, then another. And somewhere in the part of her brain that had never really left a dust-colored road 11 years and 4,000 miles away, a voice she had buried counted down with her. 3, 2, 1. If you have ever been the person in the room nobody thought to ask, the one who empties the trash can while the important conversation happens 2 feet above your head, then you already know how this story starts because it starts exactly like your life does, in the part nobody bothers to watch. This is a story about a woman the world decided to underestimate, about a chief who mistook a uniform for the whole truth of a person, and about a dog who remembered what an entire hospital had forgotten. If stories like this are the ones that stay with you, stick around, because there are more of them. And there is a subscribe button waiting for exactly the kind of person who reads to the end. 3 weeks before that morning in the corridor, Ain Doss was exactly what the badge clipped to her scrub top said she was. Environmental Services, 3rd shift. Riverside Memorial Hospital. She emptied biohazard bins in the ICU and mopped the same 11 hallways in the same order every night. And if you had asked any of the 211 people on staff to describe her, most of them would have needed a photograph to remember her face. She liked it that way. She had learned a long time ago that being forgettable was a kind of armor, and she wore it the way other people wore a coat, without thinking about it, until the day it no longer fit. She was 34 years old, unmarried, and lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from the hospital, with a police scanner she never turned on anymore, and a duffel bag in the closet she had not opened since she moved in. On her left forearm, running from the wrist, almost to the elbow, was a scar she told people came from a kitchen accident, a lie so boring that no one had ever once asked a follow-up question. She had practiced the lie so many times it no longer felt like one. Riverside Memorial had recently signed on to a community outreach initiative, a partnership between the hospital and the Metro Police Department's K-9 unit. The kind of program that photographs well for a press release. Twice a month, the unit would walk a dog through public areas of the hospital, ostensibly to familiarize the animal with medical environments in case of future emergency deployments, though everyone from the janitorial staff to the billing department understood it was mostly for the cameras. The unit was led by Chief Marcus Vance, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with 22 years on the force, and a reputation spoken of in the break room in careful, lowered voices. Vance had built his career on being photographed well. He had built his K-9 program the same way, prioritizing dogs with an intimidating silhouette over dogs with a stable temperament, and he had never once in 3 years of running the unit been contradicted by anyone who still wanted to keep their job. The dog he brought with him that first week was a Belgian Malinois named Bishop, 81 pounds of muscle and nerve, with a coat the color of scorched wheat and eyes that tracked every door in a room before the room had finished opening them. Lane was buffing the floor outside radiology when the unit came through for its first demonstration walk, and she did not look up, because looking up was not what invisible people did. But she heard it before she saw it. A low, tight whine, almost too quiet to register over the buffer, coming from a dog that a moment ago had been walking a textbook heel. She lifted the buffer's handle a half-inch, just enough to glance sideways, and she saw what everyone else in that hallway, including the chief holding the leash, had missed entirely. Bishop's weight had shifted a fraction onto his back legs. His tail, held high and stiff a second earlier, had dropped and gone rigid. His ears, cupped forward toward the sound of an overhead page, had suddenly angled back. It was not aggression. It was the exact, unmistakable posture of a working dog, absorbing more sensory input than his handler had prepared him for. A dog won bad. She had seen that posture 100 times before in places with far worse lighting and far higher stakes, and her hands, without her permission, remembered exactly what to do about it. She did not say anything. She simply reached down unhurried and set 2 knuckles against the outside of her own thigh, low and still. The universal quiet hand signal for a dog trained under a certain kind of program to disengage and reset, and she held it there for 3 full seconds while pretending to check something on the buffer's cord. Bishop's head turned toward her. His whine stopped. His weight settled back onto all 4 legs even, balanced, calm, the way a dog looks when a threat that existed only in his own overloaded nervous system. Cheif Vance never noticed the change. He kept walking, kept talking to the reporter trailing behind him about community trust and canine excellence, and Bishop fell back into an easy heel beside him as if nothing at all had happened. Lane went back to buffing the floor. It was such a small thing. It was 30 seconds out of a 7-hour shift over before anyone with a badge or a camera had thought to look. But a nurse named Priya Ahuja, restocking a supply cart nearby, had seen it, and she filed it away without understanding what she had seen, the way you file away a magic trick performed by someone who insists they know no magic at all. It happened again the second week, and the third, small corrections nobody but Priya noticed, until the 4th week, when Cheif Vance decided the outreach program needed a bigger audience. Complete with a scent detection exercise using a decoy training aid hidden inside a supply closet. It was meant to be simple. It was meant to be good for the cameras. Instead, the moment the hospital's PA system cut in with an overhead code call, sharp and sudden, 3 floors of speakers firing at once, Bishop's nerve broke entirely. The overhead page was a code blue, called from the 3rd floor, a sound engineered specifically to cut through every other noise in the building, and it did exactly what it was designed to do to the humans in that atrium, and precisely the wrong thing to a highly strung Malinois. Bishop's whole body seized. He spun a hard half-circle against the leash, snapped his teeth once at the air near Vance's hand, and backed himself into the base of a potted ficus, head low, hackles raised. A dog no longer performing for anyone but reacting, purely and dangerously, to a world that had suddenly become too loud to survive in. The administrators near the elevator bank took an audible step back. A woman from the donor relations office actually dropped her coffee, and Cheif Vance, whose entire professional identity rested on never once looking uncertain in public, did the thing that men like him nearly always do when their control slips in front of an audience. He yanked the leash hard, barked Bishop Heel, in a voice pitched for dominance rather than comfort. And when the dog only pressed harder into the ficus and let out a long, rising snarl, Vance's face went the color of a bruise forming in real time. It was Lane who moved. She had been 20 feet away with a cart of replacement paper towels, and she crossed the distance without appearing to hurry, the way people who have actually done this before move, economy over urgency, because urgency is what breaks a dog's last thread of trust. She did not go near Bishop's head. She crouched at an angle sideways, non-threatening, at a distance of about 6 feet, and she made a low, rhythmic sound in her throat, not quite a word, something closer to the cadence of a heartbeat than a command, and she held her left forearm loosely against her own chest, scar side up, the exact position a dog trained to read a handler's stress level is taught to key on. "Vance, drop the tension on the lead," she said, quiet, flat, not a request. "You're pulling against his spine. He can't hear you over his own pain receptors right now." Vance, astonished that the janitor was speaking to him at all, loosened his grip out of pure reflex before his pride caught up with him, and in the 2 seconds that followed, Bishop's snarl dropped away like a rope going slack. His hackles lowered. His eyes, which had been fixed and wild, found Lane's face and stayed there, and for one silent moment, in a hospital atrium full of donors and administrators and a chief of police holding a leash, Dan, an 81-pound Malinois, sat down at the feet of a hospital janitor, as if he had been waiting his entire life for someone to finally speak his language correctly. The atrium was silent except for the tail end of the code blue page dying out over the speakers. Then Cheif Vance, red-faced, humiliated in front of the exact audience he had assembled to admire him, said the sentence that would end up, in one form or another, at the center of every conversation about that day for weeks to come. "I don't need advice from the cleaning staff," he said, loud enough that it carried to the elevator bank, and the donor relations office and the 2 administrators already reaching for their phones. "You're just hospital staff. Get back to your cart." He said it the way men like him always say things, certain that volume would erase what had just happened in front of witnesses, certain that a badge outranks a demonstrated fact. Lane straightened up, looked at him for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable, and said nothing at all. She picked up her cart. She walked away. But Priya Ahuja, standing by the elevators with her supply cart forgotten at her side, watched her go, and for the first time began to wonder what, exactly, what none of them knew, what none of them could have known from a scar she called a kitchen accident, and a badge that said Environmental Services, was that 11 years earlier, on a road outside a town whose name she had trained herself, Staff Sergeant Lane Doss had knelt in the dirt with her hands buried to the wrist in the open chest cavity of a Belgian Malinois named Diesel, the first dog she had ever trained from an 8-week-old pup into a combat-certified explosive detection, while the vehicle 20 feet behind them still burned, and the sergeant she had been assigned to protect screamed for a medic who would not arrive in time. The blast had come from underneath the lead vehicle in a convoy Diesel had cleared 40 minutes earlier, a secondary device buried deeper than his training had prepared either of them to find. And the same explosion that killed 2 of the 4 men in that convoy tore a piece of shrapnel the length of a house key through Lane's forearm, and very nearly took the arm entirely. She remembered very little of the actual moment, the way people rarely remember the worst seconds of their lives with any coherence. But she remembered, with perfect and merciless clarity, the sound Diesel made in the dust afterward, a high, panicked whine that was nothing like his working bark. The sound of an animal who had done everything right and been punished for it anyway. She remembered pressing her uninjured hand over the wound in his side, while her own arm bled freely onto both of them, whispering the same low, rhythmic, non-word sound into his ear that she had used with him since he was a puppy too small to reach the training table. The sound that meant, in the only language that mattered between them, "I am here. You did nothing wrong. Stay with me." He did not stay. He died in her arms 9 minutes before the medevac finally reached them, and the last thing Lane Doss did before the pain and the blood loss took her under, as well, was press her forehead against his, a promise that she would never again let a good dog take the blame for a system built by people who had not earned the right to lead him. She came home with a Bronze Star she never mentioned, a medical discharge she never explained, and a scar she had decided, somewhere over the Atlantic on the flight back, would become a story about a kitchen knife instead of the truth, because the truth required a version of herself she was not ready to be responsible for again. She trained no more dogs. She sought no job anywhere near a K-9 unit, a bomb squad, or anything with a badge attached to it, because she had learned that being needed was the most dangerous thing a person like her could allow herself to feel. She became invisible on purpose. Environmental Services did not ask about her past. Environmental Services did not require her to be brave. For 7 years, it held mostly for another 11 days after the atrium. Bishop was not returned to full active duty immediately, fact the department quietly declined to publicize, and in the gap between his suspension and his supposed clearance to return, an actual patient safety threat arrived at Riverside Memorial in a form far more serious than a startled dog and a spilled coffee. A threat that would drag every piece of Lane Doss's buried history back into the light, whether she was ready for it or not. And it began, as these things so often do, with a call nobody in the building expected to be real. Came in at 6:47 in the morning. A call routed through hospital security from a blocked number. A flat, unhurried male voice informing the front desk that there was a device inside the building set to activate within the hour. Hospital protocol activated within 90 seconds. A full lockdown, ambulances diverted, non-critical patients moved to interior hallways, away from windows, and Chief Vance, whose K-9 unit happened to be on site that morning for a scheduled visit that suddenly mattered far more than anyone had planned, made the decision that would define the rest of that day. He would deploy Bishop, still officially under review, still carrying the unresolved trauma of a hallway 3 weeks earlier, into an active hospital corridor to search for an explosive device, because the alternative was admitting to his superiors that his unit's only trained detection dog was not fit for duty, and admitting that, to a man like Vance, was a worse outcome than the risk itself. Lane was on shift. She was 3 hallways away, stripping linens in a supply closet on the 2nd floor, when the lockdown announcement rolled through the overhead speakers in that same flat procedural tone hospitals reserve for their worst mornings, and something in her chest went cold and very, very still. The specific stillness of a body that has trained for exactly this, and spent a decade hoping it would never need to remember how she should have stayed in the supply closet. Every rule of the invisible life she had built for herself said, "Stay in the supply closet." Let the professionals handle it. You are hospital staff. That is all you are allowed to be anymore." She stood there for 11 seconds with her hand on the door handle, and then she opened it anyway, because some promises, it turns out, outlast even the best intentions to bury them. She reached the second-floor corridor outside the pediatric wing at 7:03, 16 minutes into the hour Vance's team had been given, and what she found there was a working dog in absolute crisis. Bishop was straining low against his lead, refusing to advance past the nurse's station, his whole body vibrating with the specific, unmistakable posture of a dog caught between his training and his terror. Officer Danny Reyes, the department's junior handler, a 26-year-old who had been on the K-9 unit for 11 months and had never once been permitted to override Vance's decisions in the field, stood beside Bishop with the leash shaking visibly in his hand. Instructions that meant nothing to a dog whose nervous system had already decided the hallway itself was the threat. "He's not clearing it," Reyes said, to no one and everyone, sweat cutting a line down his temple despite the air conditioning. "He keeps false alerting on the linen cart and then backing off the actual supply closet. I don't know if that's a real signal, or if he's just spooked again like 3 weeks ago." Vance, from 20 feet back, snapped that the dog was trained, that the dog was cleared, that they did not have time to debate an animal's feelings, with a bomb potentially 11 minutes from detonation, and it was in that exact moment, with a decorated chief screaming at a panicking rookie and a traumatized dog in an entire pediatric wing full of children, on the other side of a set of double doors, that Lane Doss stepped around the corner and said the sentence that would end in one form or another everything about the life she had spent 7 years pretending to live. "Move the linen cart first," she said. "He's not false alerting. He's telling you the cart is contaminated with a scent he's already trained on, and he's refusing the supply closet because there's a second, stronger source in there he doesn't have full confidence reading under this much ambient panic. Give him room, drop the tension on that lead, and let him work the way he was actually built to work, instead of the way you're forcing him to work right now." Vance rounded on her with the particular fury of a man being corrected twice by the same person he had already publicly dismissed once. "You again," he said. "This is an active scene. You are hospital staff. Get out of this hallway before I have you removed." And Lane, for the second time in 3 weeks, did not raise her voice at all when she answered him, which somehow landed harder than shouting ever could have. "Chief," she said, "your handler doesn't have enough working hours with this dog to read what he's telling you right now, and you are about to walk a rookie and a panicking K-9 into a live search with 16 minutes on the clock. I have read this exact posture before. I am not asking your permission. I am telling you what's about to happen if nobody moves that cart in the next 30 seconds. Vance opened his mouth to order her physically removed, and it was Bishop who answered instead. The dog's head snapped toward her ears forward, sound rising in his throat that was not a growl at all but something closer to recognition, a low, urgent, almost desperate whine, and before Officer Reyes could tighten his grip, Bishop lunged the full length of his lead directly toward Lane, and the momentum pulled the leash straight out of Reyes's startled hand. The dog closed the distance in under 2 seconds, and instead of the bite everyone in that hallway flinched to brace for, Bishop pressed his nose hard against the exposed skin of Lane's left forearm, directly over the old, ropey line of scar tissue she had spent a decade explaining away as a kitchen accident, and he held it there. breathing her in with the frantic intensity of an animal encountering something he had cataloged somewhere deep in instinct and never expected to find again. Then he sat, perfectly, silently, at her feet, the exact posture of a working dog completing a search and presenting his handler with confirmation, except that his handler, by every official document in that building, was standing 20 feet away in a chief's uniform, holding an empty leash and staring at a hospital janitor his own dog had just chosen over him in front of a hallway full of witnesses. Then Lane knelt, slow and deliberate, and pressed her forehead lightly against the top of Bishop's skull. The exact gesture, though no one else in that hallway could have known it, that she had made only once before in her life, in the dirt beside a burning convoy. "I know," she said quietly to him and not to anyone else in the room. "I know. I've got you." And then, without waiting for permission from a chief who had told her twice now that she was nothing more than hospital staff, she looked up at Officer Reyes, said, "Move the linen cart now. Gently, do not jostle it." And the entire hallway, for the first time all morning, did exactly what she told it to do. Reyes wheeled the cart back with careful hands, and the moment its shadow cleared the supply closet door, Bishop's whole body reoriented, drawn now with total, unwavering focus toward the closet itself, and Lane felt the particular sickening drop in her stomach of a search that had just become real. She rose, kept 2 fingers loosely resting against Bishop's collar in a grip so light it barely registered as contact, and walked him the final 8 feet toward the closet door with the calm, unhurried economy of someone who had done this exact walk more times than she had ever told another living soul. Sharp with panic now, instead of authority. "Get away from that door," he said. "That is not a trained procedure. You are not certified. Step back from the door right now." Lane did not step back. "Chief," she said, without turning around, "if I step back right now, your rookie handler opens that door in about 90 seconds on his own, with a dog he doesn't fully trust yet, and no one in this hallway knowing what's actually inside it. I do. Call your bomb squad. Tell them we may have a positive on a chemical accelerant device. Low yield, likely built for smoke and panic rather than structural damage, judging by his alert pattern. And tell them to clear the floor above and below us while I keep everyone in this corridor from making the one mistake that actually gets somebody killed." Vance stared at her, and something in his face, for the first time since the day she'd met him, cracked open into something closer to fear than anger, because the woman standing 8 feet from a possible explosive device in his hospital sounded less like a janitor having a strange morning, and a great deal more like someone who had said sentences like that before in far worse hallways than this one, and had lived to walk away from every single one of them. The next 11 minutes passed the way real crises pass, which is to say, not at all like the movies, not with music swelling or a dramatic wide shot, but in small, ugly, granular pieces of time that stretched and compressed unevenly, each second mattering more than the one before it. Lane kept Bishop steady at the closet door with nothing but her voice and 2 fingers on his collar, while Reyes, following instructions relayed through her in short, clipped sentences, cleared the immediate corridor of the last 2 staff members who had not yet evacuated. Vance, to his limited credit, finally did the one useful thing available to him and got the department's actual bomb technicians moving toward the building. Though the earliest estimate put them 9 minutes out, 9 minutes that felt, standing in that hallway with a scarred dog pressed against her leg, very much like 9 minutes too many, She did not open the door. Every piece of training she had ever received screamed against opening it, and even 11 years removed from active service, that particular instruction had not faded the way so much else had. What she did instead was drop into the low, patient stillness of someone whose entire adult life had once depended on the ability to wait without flinching, kneeling beside Bishop with her palm flat against his ribs, feeling the frantic drumbeat of his heart begin slowly to steady itself against her hand the way it had not steadied for anyone else all morning. And she talked to him, low and constant, the same wordless rhythmic sound she had used on a dying dog a decade earlier, except this time it was doing exactly what it was meant to do, keeping a living animal calm enough to trust the world around him again. At 7:14, 7 minutes into an 11-minute wait that had already begun to feel unbearable to everyone standing in that corridor, the overhead pediatric wing announcement system, sharp and sudden the way every overhead page in that hospital was sharp and sudden, and Bishop's entire body seized in an instant, hackles rising, a hard, panicked bark tearing out of him as he lunged half a step toward the door itself. The exact catastrophic outcome Lane had spent 7 minutes preventing, suddenly one badly timed announcement away from happening anyway. "Down," she said one word, flat and absolute, dropping her own body low and fast beside him, both hands now firm and unmoving against his shoulders, her face inches from his, and for one suspended half-second that felt like the entire length of that burning road outside a town she had trained herself never to name. It was not at all clear whether an 81-pound Malinois mid-panic would listen to a woman with no leash, no badge, and no official authority to give him any command at all. He listened. His front legs folded, his chest hit the floor, and the bark died into a low, shuddering whine as Lane kept both hands pressed against him, steady and unmoving, until his heartbeat under her palms slowed back into something survivable. Vance, watching from the far end of the corridor, said nothing at all, and it was the first true silence he had offered her since the day they met. The bomb technicians arrived at 7:19, 6 minutes ahead of the original 1-hour deadline, and within 4 careful minutes confirmed exactly what Bishop's alert pattern correctly read, and told Lane it would be a low-yield smoke and panic device crudely constructed, planted by a disgruntled former contractor with a grievance against hospital administration rather than any organized threat, powerful enough to cause chaos and possible injury in a crowded corridor. It was neutralized without incident by 7:26. No one in that hallway, staff or patient, had been harmed, a fact that would appear in exactly one paragraph of the official incident report and would completely fail to capture the 11 minutes during which a hospital janitor with a decade-old scar and an entire pediatric wing from becoming a very different kind of headline. Chief Vance stood at the end of the corridor after the technicians cleared the scene, staring at Lane Doss as she finally rose to her feet, with Bishop leaning his full weight against her leg, and the question forming on his face was not the question of a man wondering whether he'd been wrong. It was the harder, more dangerous question of a man beginning to suspect that being wrong about her might mean he had been wrong about a great deal more than he was prepared to admit in front of the growing crowd of staff, security officers. It was into that silence at 7:31 that a black government sedan pulled up outside the emergency entrance, and a woman in a plain gray suit stepped out with the unmistakable, unhurried authority of someone who had spent her entire career, in a voice that carried the length of the corridor without ever rising above a conversational register, whether she was currently standing in the same hospital where Staff Sergeant Lane Doss, formerly of the 47th Military Working Dog Detachment, had just been reported by 3 separate 911 calls from hospital staff as having single-handedly managed an active explosive threat with her bare hands and a dog she had never officially been assigned. The woman's name, though it would take several more minutes, and a great deal of stunned silence for anyone in that corridor to fully absorb it, was Colonel Grace Okafor, and she had not driven 90 minutes from the Regional Veterans Affairs Office that morning, which her office had learned about only 20 minutes earlier through a routine law enforcement bulletin. She had come because the bulletin, filed hastily by a dispatcher who had no idea what she was actually reporting, had included one detail that made Colonel Okafor set down her coffee and pick up her car keys without finishing a sentence to her own staff, a K-9 officer's report describing an unidentified hospital employee who had calmed a police dog. Mid-crisis, using a non-standard vocal cue and hand signal that the responding officer, in his own confused write-up, had described as almost like a code, like she trained him that way herself. Colonel Okafor had run the military's Advanced K-9 Handler Certification Program for 6 years, the same program that, 11 years and one continent ago, had certified a 23-year-old staff sergeant named Lane Doss as one of the youngest handlers ever cleared for combat zone explosive detection work. Built around exactly the kind of low rhythmic vocal cue and light contact hand signal that had just been described in a confused civilian dispatcher's report, had been considered so effective that portions of them were later folded into the program's standard curriculum. Taught to every handler who came after her, without most of them ever learning whose instincts they'd been built on. Colonel Okafor had also been the officer who, 11 years earlier, had personally signed the Bronze Star citation Lane Doss never mentioned to anyone, and who had spent a decade wondering without ever fully admitting it to herself what had happened to the sharpest young handler she had ever certified after she vanished so completely from every record the Army kept. She found Lane still kneeling beside Bishop near the supply closet, her uniform scrubs streaked with hallway grime, her scarred forearm still resting against the dog's flank, and Colonel Okafor stopped 3 feet away and simply looked at her for a long moment before she spoke. "Sergeant Doss," she said, and the rank alone, spoken aloud in that corridor for the first time in 7 years, seemed to physically alter the air around them, pulling every remaining head in the hallway toward the two of them at once. "It's been a long time." Lane looked up at her, and for the first time since the atrium 3 weeks earlier, something in her carefully maintained composure, visibly, quietly, gave way. "Colonel," she said, and her voice, so steady through the entire morning's crisis, cracked slightly on the single word. "I'm not that person anymore." Colonel Okafor's gaze moved, deliberate and unhurried, from Lane's face down to the dog pressed against her side, still leaning into her as though he had waited his entire career for exactly this moment, and then further still to the old scar visible along her forearm before returning to meet her eyes directly. "Based on the last 20 minutes of this hospital's incident log," Okafor said, "I'd say that person never actually left." Turning to address the corridor at large, to Chief Vance, to Officer Reyes, to the small crowd of hospital staff and administrators who had gathered at a cautious distance, because women who have spent 30 years in rooms full of men, who outrank them by title, alone, learn very early that volume is rarely necessary when the facts are sufficient on their own. "For those of you who don't know who you're looking at," she said, "this is Staff Sergeant Lane Doss, formerly of the 47th Military Working Dog Detachment, one of the most decorated combat K-9 handlers to serve in her unit's history, awarded the Bronze Star for actions during an IED strike that killed 2 soldiers and her own K-9 partner, and the developer of several vocal and tactile training protocols that the Department of Defense has used to certify handlers for nearly a decade." protocols, I'll add, that this dog just responded to flawlessly under live threat conditions from a woman with no leash, no radio, and apparently no official title in this building beyond hospital staff. She let the last two words land with exactly the same weight Cheif Vance had used to dismiss Lane 3 weeks earlier that same hallway, and the silence that followed had an entirely different texture than the silence before it. Cheif Vance, whose face had gone through several distinct shades of color over the course of that single sentence, found himself, for perhaps the first time in his career, without a single word ready to defend himself with. It was Priya Ahuja, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd with her supply cart still forgotten somewhere behind her, who finally broke the silence, stepping forward with the particular courage of someone who has spent 3 weeks quietly rehearsing a sentence she was not sure she would ever have the nerve to say out loud. "I saw her do this before," Priya said to Colonel Okafor, to the crowd, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. "Weeks ago with the same dog." She calmed him down twice before anyone else even noticed something was wrong, and Cheif Vance told her to get back to her cart. The admission, small as it was, cracked something loose in the corridor, because it was the first time anyone besides Lane herself had said out loud in front of witnesses exactly what had actually been happening in that hospital for the past month. The formal review convened 4 days later, not because anyone particularly wanted it to, but because Colonel Okafor's arrival and the 3 separate 911 calls describing a civilian's role in diffusing an active threat. It was held in a windowless conference room on the hospital's administrative floor, a room that had clearly been designed for budget meetings rather than reckonings, and Lane sat at one end of a long table in a set of scrubs, because she owned nothing resembling a uniform anymore and had refused, when offered, to borrow one. Cheif Vance sat at the other end with the department's legal counsel beside him, and between them sat a review panel that included the hospital's chief administrator, a representative from the police department's oversight board, and, at Colonel Okafor's insistence, herself. It was Officer Danny Reyes called first to give his account of the morning, who did the thing none of the senior officials in that room had expected, producing from his jacket pocket a small worn notebook, the kind issued to every K-9 handler in the department to log training hours, incidents, and certification updates for each animal under their care. "I kept my own copy," Reyes said, sliding it across the table with hands that were not quite steady, "because the official logs Cheif Vance submits to the department don't match what I actually did with Bishop in the field. He signed off on training hours neither of us completed. He's marked Bishop as fully recertified after the incident 3 weeks ago in this exact hospital without ever actually running him through a recertification evaluation, because scheduling an outside evaluator would have meant admitting the dog had a problem, and admitting that would have meant admitting the unit's budget request last quarter, built entirely around Bishop's supposed readiness for expanded deployment, was based on paperwork that wasn't true. The room went very still. Colonel Okafor opened the notebook, turned 3 pages, and set it down with the flat, controlled anger of someone who had spent a career watching good animals get hurt by exactly this kind of shortcut. "Cheif Vance," she said, "would you like to explain to this panel why your official certification log shows 14 more training hours for this animal in the last 2 months than your own handler's field notes?" Vance's legal counsel tried to intervene, tried to frame the discrepancy as a paperwork error, an oversight, the kind of clerical drift that happens in any busy department, but Colonel Okafor was not interested in framing. "I've spent 30 years reading training logs," she said. "This isn't drift. This is a chief who falsified a working animal's readiness record to protect a budget line and his own public image, and then humiliated, twice, in front of witnesses, but a hospital full of children from becoming a very different kind of story than the one we're sitting here discussing today. She turned finally to Lane, who had said almost nothing through the entire proceeding, sitting with her scarred forearm resting quietly on the table in full view, for what was likely the first time in a decade. "Sergeant Doss," Okafor said, "is there anything you'd like to add to the record before this panel makes its recommendation?" Lane was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Vance, watching her from the far end of the table, seemed almost to brace for something worse than anything that had come before. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, unhurried, entirely without triumph. "I didn't come back to this hospital to be right about a dog," she said. "I came back because I made a promise a long time ago to an animal who died doing exactly what he was trained to do, that I would never again let a good dog take the blame for a system built by people who hadn't earned the right to lead him. Bishop didn't fail anyone 3 weeks ago in that atrium, and he didn't fail anyone 6 days ago in that corridor. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do, reacting exactly the way any animal reacts when the person responsible for him prioritizes his image over his actual readiness. That's not a training problem. That's a leadership problem, and it's the same problem that got 2 soldiers and my own partner killed on a road I still dream about most nights. Except that road didn't come with security cameras and a review panel." She looked, finally, directly at Vance, for the first time since the proceeding began. "You told me twice that I was just hospital staff," she said. "You were right. I am hospital staff. I chose that on purpose after I stopped being able to live with the version of myself who wasn't. But being hospital staff never once meant I stopped being able to read a dog better than the man holding his leash, and it never will." The panel's recommendation, delivered 11 days later in a decision that made the front page of the Metro section, rather than the splashy human interest piece the hospital's donor relations office had initially hoped for, was unambiguous. Chief Marcus Vance was removed from command of the K-9 unit and reassigned to a desk position, pending a full audit of every training record he had submitted over the preceding 3 years, an audit that would eventually uncover discrepancies affecting 4 additional dogs and 2 additional handlers, none of whom had ever had a hospital janitor in the hallway to catch the problem before it became a headline. Bishop was formally reassigned to Officer Danny Reyes as his primary handler, alongside a full outside evaluation and an actual honestly logged recertification process that took 6 careful weeks rather than the falsified 14 hours Vance had claimed. And Colonel Grace Okafor, in a decision that surprised absolutely no one who had watched her in that conference room, personally extended an offer to Lane Doss to return, in whatever capacity she wanted, to the same advanced K-9 handler certification program she had once helped build. This time as a civilian consultant with full authority to design a curriculum around exactly the instincts that had kept an entire pediatric wing safe, with nothing but her voice and a decade-old scar. Lane thought about it for 6 days, which surprised the people who knew her only slightly, and surprised no one who had actually watched her rebuild a quiet, forgettable life out of the wreckage of a much louder one. In the end, she said yes to part of the offer and no to the rest of it. She would consult remotely twice a month, helping design training protocols for handlers who would never know her name attached to the methods that kept them and their dogs alive. She would not return full-time to a uniform or a title or a life built around being seen. She kept her job at Riverside Memorial, and on her next scheduled shift, 3 weeks after the review panel's decision, she was back in the same 11 hallways in the same order, buffing floors and emptying bins, invisible again by choice, rather than necessity, except that now, twice a week, Officer Danny Reyes brought Bishop by on his lunch break, ostensibly for continued familiarization with hospital environments, though everyone on staff understood by then that the dog simply refused to have a good day without seeing her first. It was Priya Ahuja who asked her, one slow evening near the end of a shift, sitting together in the break room while Bishop dozed with his head resting across both of their feet, why she had never told anyone, in 7 full years, exactly who she used to be. Lane considered the question longer than the question probably deserved, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table in front of her. "Because for a long time," she said finally, "I thought being someone again meant I had to be loud about it. I thought healing looked like a medal on a wall and a title on a door. It turns out it just looks like showing up quietly for the people and the animals nobody else is paying close enough attention to save, and letting that be enough, even when nobody's watching, especially then, actually." She reached down without looking and rested her scarred forearm against Bishop's flank, and the dog, without waking, leaned his full weight into the contact the way he had leaned into her in that corridor, and the way, she suspected, he probably always would. Priya nodded slowly, watching the two of them, and then asked the question that had clearly been sitting behind the first one the whole time. "Would you ever tell anyone else? Ever go back to it full time, I mean?" Lane smiled, the small, private smile of someone who has finally made peace with a decision most people would have found impossible to understand. "I don't think the real version of it and this version of it are actually different things," she said. "I think that's the part everyone gets wrong. It was never about the uniform. It was about paying attention closely enough to notice what everyone else was too busy, or too proud, or too certain of their own authority to see. You can do that with a mop in your hand, just as well as you can do it with a leash." She looked down at Bishop, still asleep, still leaning into her, and then back up at Priya. "Sometimes better," she added, "because nobody's watching a woman with a mop closely enough to stop her before she gets there. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you when the screen goes dark, let it be this. The people who are easiest to overlook are so often the ones who have already survived the hardest version of the exact crisis unfolding in front of you. And a title, a badge, or a chief's confident volume in an atrium full of cameras will never be a reliable substitute for the quiet, patient competence of someone who simply knows what they're doing and has stopped needing anyone else's permission to do it well. Somewhere in your own life, in your own hallway, there is probably a person exactly like Lane Doss. The only real question this story leaves you with is whether you will be the kind of person who notices them before the crisis, or only after. If this story moved you even a little, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more true stories about the underestimated people who were the strongest ones in the room the entire time.